December 8, 1941, inside the Imperial Naval Headquarters in Tokyo, Admiral Osami Nagano read the reports from Pearl Harbor with grim satisfaction. 8 American battleships lay crippled or destroyed, nearly 200 aircraft reduced to wreckage, and 2,400 Americans dead. To the Admiral, the Pacific Fleet appeared broken beyond repair, its threat removed in a single masterstroke. What he could not imagine, what no officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy could even conceive, was that in forgotten American harbors, rows of rusting ships from another war, hulks left to decay in silence, were about to become the foundation of a naval rebirth unlike anything the world had ever seen. Within 2 years, U.S. shipyards would defy every expectation, achieving production speeds that Japanese planners believed impossible. Launching new warships so quickly, the Imperial Navy could not even track them, much less sink them. Along the James River near Fort Eustis, Virginia, one such reserve fleet waited. It was a graveyard of steel where the ghosts of World War I still floated, more than 100 vessels left in varying states of decay, kept alive only by the faintest touch of maintenance through the lean years of the 1930s. They lingered in a strange purgatory of bureaucracy, too costly to maintain yet too valuable to discard, dismissed as relics unfit for modern war. But on the morning of December 8th, that silent graveyard came alive. Orders swept through the anchorage with breathtaking urgency. Every vessel that could possibly float was to be returned to service, and immediately. Teams from Norfolk Naval Shipyard and swarms of civilian contractors descended on the forgotten hulks, confronting sites that seemed more like ruins than warships. Engine rooms lay drowned in stagnant water, machinery eaten away by rust, ventilation shafts clogged with bird nests, and in some cases, decks choked with weeds and wild growth. Yet within weeks, the impossible began to unfold. Ships that had not stirred in decades rumbled back to life, their hulls groaning as they moved once again, under their own power. Among the first was the USS Bridgeport, a German liner seized in 1917, now resurrected with black smoke curling skyward from funnels that had stood cold for more than 10 years. By the spring of 1942, dozens of vessels had risen from reserve, rebuilt and pressed into service. They were not the proud capital ships that captured headlines, but the lifeblood of a war effort, repair ships. Their resurrection gave America what it needed most in those desperate first months, reinforcement in steel and hulls, at a moment when every vessel mattered. Yet in Tokyo, the Imperial Navy's intelligence services failed to see the storm that was building. Small in size and chronically understaffed, their analysts tried to measure American capabilities, with logic that seemed sound but was fatally flawed. They estimated the United States might build 500,000 tons of warships each year, perhaps 2 million tons of merchant vessels at full stretch. They calculated shipways, tallied steel production, and weighed labor supply with the precision of accountants. Naval attachés who had lived in Washington returned with reports of inefficiency, strikes, racial divisions, and a society softened by years of peace. One document even observed that American shipyards resisted overtime, their workers unwilling to break routine. On paper, it all seemed correct. In reality, it was a profound miscalculation. For what Japanese analysts could not grasp was how swiftly America's fractured industries would unite. The same unions once locked in disputes would pledge a wartime truce, promising no strikes until victory was won, turning America's industrial heartland into a furnace of relentless production. They saw segregation and assumed division, never imagining that war would force new, if limited, opportunities for minorities in defense industries. Any officer who dared suggest America might achieve greater capacity found his report ignored or dismissed outright. The Imperial Navy's strategy clung to the doctrine of Kai Kessen, the belief in a single decisive naval battle that would end the conflict within a year. If victory was to come swiftly, then America's long-term industrial strength seemed meaningless. But the gamble was a fatal one. By 1943, the United States was producing more than 19 million tons of shipping, nearly 10 times the figure Japanese planners had considered the ceiling of possibility. This was no mere intelligence oversight. It was a catastrophic failure to understand the full power of a society capable of uniting under the pressure of total war. At the center of this transformation stood the U.S. Maritime Commission, Once a modest New Deal agency tasked with overseeing a shrinking merchant marine, it now became the driving force behind a shipbuilding miracle. Admiral Emery S. Land, a man who understood both engineering precision and bureaucratic machinery, issued a command as bold as it was ruthless: build ships faster than the enemy could sink them. The Maritime Commission's expanded wartime powers turned it into the architect of an industrial army. It could seize shipyards, redirect raw materials, assign labor, and coordinate every moving part of America's production machine. This hidden web of organization, invisible to Japanese intelligence that measured only tonnage and ship counts, would prove as decisive as the steel hulls themselves. At the heart of this effort stood the Liberty Ship Program, a bold embrace of simplicity. Based on a British design for basic cargo carriers, the Liberty ships were stripped of elegance and built for speed, reciprocating engines instead of fragile turbines, straight lines instead of graceful curves. They were ships that could be assembled by men and women who had never set foot in a shipyard before. The first, the SS Patrick Henry, launched on September 27, 1941, took 244 days to build. By early 1942, the timeline dropped below 100 days. By the end of that same year, some yards were finishing ships in under 50 days, each launch a symbol of America's accelerating momentum. But steel alone would not win the oceans. The Commission moved just as aggressively to forge the human element. Training programs took farmers, mechanics, and clerks and turned them into sailors in a matter of weeks. The Merchant Marine Academy slashed its curriculum from 4 years to 18 months, pushing cadets into the war effort at breakneck speed. By the war's end, 250,000 new merchant mariners had been trained. A force larger than Japan's entire maritime workforce, conjured from nothing in record time to crew the vessels of America's industrial miracle. The Kaiser Revolution began with a man who knew nothing of ships, but everything about building the impossible. Henry Kaiser had carved rivers into dams, and now he turned that same vision toward shipbuilding with ideas that would shatter centuries of tradition. His philosophy was brutally efficient. Divide every complex task into simple steps, push work forward in parallel, and invest in the people who did the labor. At Richmond, California, where 4 vast yards would soon bristle with 55 shipways, Kaiser unleashed an assembly line approach to the sea, where traditional yards built vessels slowly, piece by piece from the keel upward. His yards erupted in simultaneous construction. Bow sections took shape in one corner, stern sections in another. Deck houses rose off-site fully wired and outfitted, then dropped into place like parts of a machine. Just as radical was his vision for the workforce. Skilled shipwrights were in short supply, but Kaiser refused to lower standards. Instead, he changed the work itself. Rather than demand every man be a master builder, he made each a specialist. A welder might learn only a single joint, but he would execute it with flawless precision thousands of times. In this way, he transformed inexperience into speed, chaos into rhythm, and untrained hands into the engines of history's greatest shipbuilding miracle. Kaiser's revolution did not stop at the slipways. He built the infrastructure that industry required, carving entire cities from empty land to house his workers. When healthcare became a bottleneck, he created a system that would endure into peacetime, Kaiser Permanente. When childcare threatened productivity, he opened 24-hour nurseries. Every obstacle was identified, dismantled and replaced with efficiency. By mid-1942, his shipyards were launching Liberty ships at a pace that defied imagination. Specific record construction claims may be debated, but the results were undeniable. Richmond alone would deliver more than 700 vessels before the war's end, a fleet conjured from nothing in just a few years. Yet Pearl Harbor remained the paradox. Tactically brilliant, the strike was strategically flawed. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, its architect, knew this more than anyone. Educated at Harvard and seasoned in Washington, he had seen America's factories and understood their potential. His warning, that Japan might run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, was rooted in that knowledge. The raid's immediate success seemed to vindicate Japanese planning. 8 battleships shattered, thousands killed. But crucial targets were missed. The American carriers were not in port. Repair yards, fuel tanks, and the submarine base remained untouched. These oversights gave the Pacific Fleet the means to recover far faster than Tokyo imagined, and the deeper miscalculation was political. Pearl Harbor did what decades of debate had not. It unified the United States overnight. Isolationist voices fell silent. Workers who once resisted overtime now labored double shifts. Unions froze strike actions. Women by the millions stepped into factories welding, riveting, and launching ships. The statistics tell the story. Ship deliveries climbed month by month in 1942, not only because new yards came online, but because every yard, every worker, every system grew sharper, faster, more relentless. By mid-1942, American shipyards were achieving what Japanese planners had declared impossible. Liberty ship production surged. 5 in January, 14 in March, 33 in June, 67 in September. In October 1943, the peak arrived. 106 Liberty ships in a single month, more than 3 per day. For Japanese intelligence, the numbers were inconceivable. Neutral reports describing American ports crowded with hundreds of new vessels were dismissed as lies, exaggerations, or accounting tricks. Any explanation was easier than facing reality. Each Liberty ship was not just a hull, but the product of staggering organization. Thousands of tons of steel arriving in sequence. Engines from multiple manufacturers arriving on schedule. Components from hundreds of suppliers flowing without delay. The system itself was as impressive as the ships it delivered. Meanwhile, the reactivated reserve fleet added a vital second layer. Repair ships that patched battle damage on the spot. Tankers that pushed striking range farther across the Pacific. Ammunition ships that fed the insatiable appetite of America's gunnery doctrine. Japanese submarine commanders saw the truth firsthand. Their patrol reports, often dismissed as exaggeration by distant superiors, described an America that was building not a navy, but an armada. Commander Kinashi Takazu of the I-19 delivered a rare success in September 1942, sending the carrier USS Wasp to the bottom. Yet even his triumph was overshadowed by what he reported in the aftermath, the endless procession of fresh American warships pouring into the Pacific. Kinashi's later patrols told a darker story. What had once been a hunting ground was turning into a gauntlet of steel and fire. Convoys grew larger, their escorts denser, the skies above thick with patrol aircraft. By 1943, an attack on an American convoy was no longer an opportunity. It was nearly a suicide mission. The shift was the product of sheer industrial might. Escort carriers, many converted from merchant hulls, now provided air cover deep into the Pacific. Destroyer escorts, rolling from shipyards by the hundreds, prowled relentlessly for submarines. Radar sharpened, sonar grew more sensitive, and the hunters became the hunted. By late 1943, Japanese submarines were no longer predators but desperate couriers, running supplies to stranded garrisons. One commander, bitter with defeat, wrote that America seemed to have built a destroyer for every ton of rice in Japan. Meanwhile, the American shipyard ecosystem reached its zenith. Kaiser's Richmond yards roared day and night without pause, a living organism of steel and flame. Prefabrication had evolved into a marvel of precision. 200-ton bow sections, assembled like children's blocks, sterns slid into place with shafts already mounted, deck houses arriving pre-wired and plumbed, ready to be dropped into position. The ships came together like vast, three-dimensional puzzles. The workforce itself was transformed. Women made up nearly a third of employees in some yards, and minorities, though still facing discrimination, entered industrial roles once closed to them. Most had less than a year's experience, yet their productivity surpassed that of seasoned pre-war shipwrights. The supporting infrastructure was equally staggering. Rail lines snaked through the yards, carrying steel and engines in constant motion. Specially designed cranes lifted sections older builders swore could never be moved. Foundries, machine shops, and assembly halls operated in seamless rhythm. It was an industrial symphony, each part tuned to deliver ships at a pace no enemy could hope to equal. For Japanese commanders, recognition of the inevitable came slowly, first as a whisper of doubt, then as a flood of despair. The turning point arrived in June 1944, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Task Force 58 appeared with more carriers, battleships and escorts than the entire Imperial Navy had possessed before the war. American pilots slaughtered Japanese aviators in what they called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. More than 400 Japanese aircraft fell, at the cost of fewer than 30 American planes. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, commander of the combined fleet, later admitted that after the Marianas he knew the war was lost. Japan faced an enemy that had built a navy too vast to challenge, supplied by merchant fleets it could not sink, powered by industries it could not match. The final proof came from above. In late 1944, B-29 bombers darkened Japan's skies, flying from newly captured Marianas bases. These giants flew at altitudes Japanese fighters could barely reach, and even when intercepted, they were rarely stopped. Each bomber was itself a symbol of American power. Massive, complex, breathtakingly expensive, and yet mass-produced in numbers that staggered belief. And as America's war machine pressed forward, the Liberty ship gave way to its successor, the Victory ship, sleeker, faster, more durable, an evolution of industrial warfare with no equal. Even as Liberty ships thundered down the ways in their thousands, the Maritime Commission looked forward. Their successor was already on the slipways, the Victory ship. Faster, stronger, more durable, it solved the limitations of its predecessor, while preserving the miracle of mass production, where Liberty ships could only manage 11 knots, making them easy prey for submarines. Victory ships pushed to 15 and even 17 knots, fast enough to outrun surfaced U-boats and shave days from Pacific crossings. Their redesigned hulls corrected the structural weaknesses that had caused some Liberties to crack under stress. Just as remarkable was the transition itself. Shipyards shifted from Liberty to Victory construction without faltering. Workers adapted to new techniques seamlessly, keeping pace even as complexity rose. By mid-1944, Victory ships were rolling off the lines as quickly as the simpler Liberties once had. More than 500 would be built, many serving decades into the Cold War. Their durability a vindication of the philosophy that quantity need not mean poor quality. The industrial miracle carried with it a social revolution. Shipyards became laboratories of change. Women filled roles once deemed impossible, welders, riveters, crane operators, proving every assumption wrong. African Americans, though still constrained by segregation and discrimination, gained opportunities in skilled trades once barred to them. And behind the yards, Kaiser's vision extended into daily life. To keep his workforce healthy and reliable, he built something unprecedented: prepaid healthcare, the foundation of what would become Kaiser Permanente. To ensure no mother had to choose between childcare and production, he opened 24-hour nurseries. Entire cities rose overnight, like Vanport near Portland, which swelled to more than 40,000 people and became Oregon's second-largest city. These were not acts of charity. They were investments in output. Healthy workers produced more. Workers with housing near the yards wasted no hours commuting. Parents with safe childcare could work any shift. Every human barrier to production was dismantled as ruthlessly as any logistical one. The results were staggering. As experience deepened and systems refined, man-hours per ship collapsed. By late 1944, a Liberty ship required barely a third of the labor it had demanded in early 1942. This was not mere efficiency. It was the reinvention of work itself. By 1945, the arithmetic of defeat was inescapable. In the Philippines, American fleets projected overwhelming force across vast oceans, assembling invasion armadas of hundreds of ships with supply chains stretching like steel highways across the Pacific. At Iwo Jima, the preliminary bombardment unleashed more firepower than many nations possessed in total. At Okinawa, the U.S. Navy massed more than 1,400 vessels, likely the largest armada in history. Against this industrial avalanche, Japan unleashed the kamikaze in desperate fury. Brave pilots inflicted painful losses, but strategically it changed nothing. The ocean tide of American industry rolled onward, inexhaustible, undeniable. Dozens of ships went down under kamikaze fury. Hundreds more limped home battered and scarred. In any previous war, such losses might have crippled an offensive. But against the relentless tide of American industry, they were absorbed with scarcely a ripple. Ships were repaired and sent back into battle. Replacements slid down the ways before the wrecks had even settled on the seafloor. By the summer of 1945, The US Navy moved across the Pacific with a casual abundance that in 1941 would have seemed the stuff of fantasy. The war's end is often remembered in the blinding flash of atomic fire, yet those bombs obscured a deeper truth. Japan was already crushed, not by sudden destruction, but by years of industrial arithmetic. Hiroshima and Nagasaki accelerated surrender, but defeat had been sealed in the shipyards. Between December 1941 and August 1945, America built more than 5,000 merchant vessels, over 50 million deadweight tons. Japan produced only a fraction of that. America launched more ships in a single month than Japan could in an entire year. And it was not only numbers. Liberty ships gave way to victory ships. Welding techniques improved. Cracks were solved. Quality rose even as output soared. Innovation never paused. It was this trinity, quantity, quality, and continuous improvement, that proved unanswerable. Admiral Emery Land's Maritime Commission had orchestrated victory not through strategy, but through logistics. Ships built faster than they could be sunk. Crews trained faster than they could be lost. It was warfare reduced to mathematics, and in that equation, Japan had no path to survival. Post-war interrogations revealed how painfully Japanese officers came to accept that truth. One admiral described the war in a series of bitter milestones. After Midway, we lost the initiative. After Guadalcanal, we lost momentum. After the Marianas, we lost the war. After the Philippines, we awaited the end. After Okinawa, we prayed for it. For the Japanese people, recognition lagged, dulled by propaganda promising victory even as cities burned. But B-29 raids, naval bombardments, and the submarine blockade made the truth unavoidable. By spring 1945, most civilians knew the war was lost, though few dared to speak it. The refusal to accept reality prolonged the slaughter, costing hundreds of thousands of lives in battles fought for nothing but denial. The atomic bombs, in the end, offered Tokyo a mask to surrender behind, a way to accept what American shipyards had already decided. The lessons outlived the war. The resurrection of the reserve fleets and the unprecedented shipbuilding surge demonstrated what democratic societies, once united, could achieve. Mobilizations authoritarian planners could never imagine. Prefabrication, modular construction, and specialized labor became cornerstones of global industry. The social changes forged in the shipyards, women welding steel, minorities advancing into skilled trades, employers providing healthcare and childcare, reshaped American society long after victory was won. The war in the Pacific was decided, not only in battles fought with bombs and bullets, but in the silent thunder of hammers, welders, and cranes. In the end, it was not just fleets that were built in American shipyards, it was victory itself. Japanese intelligence's failure was never simply about what it saw, but how it interpreted what it saw. Information was gathered, but cultural assumptions and rigid doctrine twisted it beyond use. Analysts could count ship hulls, but not conceive of the system that built them. They could sketch factories, but not imagine their metamorphosis into war machines. They grasped tactics with brilliance, but logistics remained invisible. In contrast, Japan fielded daring tactics, seasoned crews, and unwavering spirit, while America unleashed industry, organization, and arithmetic. And in the brutal calculus of industrial war, it was production that mattered more than courage, logistics more than maneuvers, mathematics more than spirit. The reactivation of America's reserve fleet in 1941 was more than a scramble to put old ships to sea. It was the opening act of an industrial drama that would decide the war. Shipyards, steel mills, and training centers became battlefields in their own right, and their victories proved more decisive than any single clash of fleets. Japan's great miscalculation was not in underestimating American tactics, but in misunderstanding American society itself. What looked like inefficiency in peace became unmatched mobilization in war. They prepared for a conflict of decisive naval battles. America prepared for a war of production. Men like Henry Kaiser didn't just build ships, they reinvented industry. Prefabrication, modular construction, and specialized labor would influence global manufacturing long after the guns fell silent. Socially, the war cracked barriers once thought immovable. women welding steel, minorities advancing into skilled trades, and employers providing healthcare and housing to sustain workers. What began as emergency measures reshaped American society permanently. The human story was one of triumph and tragedy. American workers performed production miracles. Japanese forces fought with desperate bravery against an opponent whose strength grew faster than it could be diminished. Civilians on both sides bore the cost of war, but in the end the outcome was sealed not on the battlefield, but in the factory and the shipyard. The lesson endures. Industrial capacity remains the foundation of military power. Production still defines strategy. Democracies, often dismissed for their peacetime divisions, still hold the power to mobilize in ways authoritarian systems cannot predict. The reserve fleet ships of 1941 carried more than cargo across the Pacific. They carried proof that an industrial democracy, when awakened, could shift the balance of global power. The arithmetic was merciless. America could build ships faster than Japan could sink them, train crews faster than Japan could kill them, and replace supplies faster than Japan could destroy them. This was not merely victory, it was the transformation of warfare itself. The age of decisive battles was over, the age of industrial war had arrived, and Japan, triumphant in December 1941, was reduced to ashes by August 1945, not for lack of courage, but for lack of capacity, defeated not by superior tactics, but by overwhelming production, not by greater courage, but by greater capacity. That was the fate of Imperial Japan. The reserve fleets that rose from American waters unleashed an industrial tidal wave, turning the Pacific War from a clash of navies into a contest of arithmetic. The outcome became inevitable long before the final battles were fought. The great irony is that Japan's post-war rebirth would rest upon the very methods that had crushed its empire. Shipyards, once reduced to rubble, would adopt American-style prefabrication and modular construction. Factories would embrace mass production. In time, the same principles that forged America's wartime supremacy would propel Japan into becoming an economic powerhouse, proving that the tools of victory in war could just as easily become the engines of peace. Thus, the saga of America's Ghost Fleet is more than a story of ships. It is the story of warfare itself transformed. When industrial capacity merges with national will, when democratic societies fully mobilize, and when production becomes strategy, traditional military calculations collapse under the weight of industrial arithmetic. The vessels reactivated in 1941 did more than sail supplies across the Pacific. They carried with them the blueprint for a new age of conflict, an age where the factory floor was as decisive as the battlefield, the assembly line as critical as the battle line, and where victory belonged not only to the boldest commander, but to the society that could outbuild, outproduce, and outlast all others.